Thanks for coming back for the second part of the discussion on credibility, which is, we think, the foundation of responsible advocacy. This section will focus on character and goodwill and also dynamism. So let's start right out with this notion around sound character and goodwill being one aspect of an audience member's ascription of credibility to the speakers. So the first thing to remember is that audience members determine what good character means to them, right? Just like credibility, an audience gets to decide, what does somebody of good character mean to you? And as you can imagine, that can be different for different audiences. It can be just as you change perhaps the way that you tell stories or the parts of yourself you press forward in presentation to different people in your lives so that they think well of you. Maybe you have different styles with your grandparents than you do with your friends hanging out, right? You're adjusting your self-presentation to forward those aspects of your character that those particular people in your life are going to appreciate. Same thing happens with audiences and advocates. So we'll first start out with a discussion of what traits might audiences typically expect to see as indicators of good character, and how might that differ according to audience. We'll discuss that in class on Wednesday. I want to make 3 points about this notion around sound character and goodwill. One of those is that good character in an argument matters. You know, people won't even listen to what you have to say or take it very seriously if they don't believe that you perhaps have their best interests at heart, or at least you don't have only your best interests at heart and you're generally a good person. As you read in the text, this goes back a long way, right? In particular to Quintilian, who was credited with the perception of argumentation and rhetoric being a good man, a man in those times, speaking well, right? And so the speaking well was inextricably linked to being a good person. And so good character still matters, I think. Although that depends on what audience it is, if they determine that to be good character. Which is the second point. Audience members determine what good character means to them. Although trustworthiness, as we look at the studies, seems to cut across most categories. In most cases, being trustworthy goes along with being someone that we are willing to listen to. And 3, this can differ according to communities and according to different fields of argument. Right? Fields of argument are different. If you had composition here, you might be thinking about them as communities of argument, right? Different areas that have different expectations around the kinds of things that they take to be true. Identification can be an instrument of credibility. Identification was first really forwarded by Kenneth Burke, a rhetorician from the early 20th century or mid 20th century really, and he talked about identification as a way of persuasion. If you were in persuasion class, you probably heard me talk about this as homophily, which is what your textbook authors talked about it there. It's essentially the same thing. It means that audiences are persuaded more readily, at least when they believe that advocates are like them in some important way. Those ways can vary, right? But it needs to be a little bit significant. Maybe they think someone at least understands or feels like they are aligned with their values. Perhaps their roles, right? We see roles happen a lot, all the time. I think the example maybe using in the text was choosing moms choose Jif, right? So focusing on moms as the important role in trying to sell less peanut butter. Maybe people appeal to you based on different roles. Your role as a child or as a sibling or as a student or as a young adult, I don't know. But also interests. People are aligned with various interests as long as the audience believes that in some kind of way we are understandable and understood. That helps with persuasion. Identification also shows audience members that speakers understand and respect them, or it should show that they understand and respect them in fundamental ways. Audiences like to be respected. I mean, that's pretty understandable, I think. They don't want to be thought of badly. They want to be taken seriously and spoken with. There's a couple of examples that we can think about with examples of identification. I pulled these from old advertisements, political advertisements, but you can see that they're appealing to different people, right? But they're doing it really very directly. So the woman on the top says, "I'll be voting for the first time," right? So she's also identifying with maybe even some of you, right? She grew up during a Great Recession. Her friends watched so many of our parents and adults struggle just to get by, and I want to make a difference for my generation where anyone has the drive and desire to go to college, where good jobs are plentiful, and where I know I'll get paid the same as a man for doing the same work. So she's advocating that you vote for Bernie Sanders because she believes that he will, his campaign believes that she will convince you, right, that she is like you in important ways and she thinks this. So you should also accept this as your candidate. It's much more direct. Below, right, we see a white woman crossing her arms, leaning against what's obviously the tailgate of a pickup truck. There's mountains in the background, right? This is a candidate, and it says "Protect Freedom" on her bumper sticker there. Keep your hands off our guns, right? If you identify with that, if you live in a place that looks like that, if you look like her or are surrounded by people that look like her, she's trying to help you believe that she identifies with you and she understands you and she will represent you. So identification is a really powerful means of demonstrating your character. But there are limits, right? Limits to identification. Efforts need to appear genuine. They can't seem like pandering to an audience or that they're fake in some kind of way. I think it was Josh Hawley who caught some flack in the last year or so for showing up at various, well, I guess it was more than a year ago now if he was showing up at various sporting events, but showing up at various sporting events when he was running for Congress to demonstrate his allegiance to Missouri sports, right? But in ways that were perhaps seeming forced based on his dress that looked like it was trying to fit in but wasn't, right? There are also limits to identification when we're using, for example, the language of the people that we're speaking to. So burned into my memory is a class from about 12 years ago, probably, maybe 15 years ago now, I've been here a long time, where I was trying to learn some slang, right? And suggested to my argumentation class at the time that I was excited about a new album that was dropping. And they just laughed at me, right? They didn't they were happy that I tried, but trying to use their language didn't seem genuine and didn't seem appropriate to me and my more formal demeanor and my age, probably even at that time, right? So as one student told me my first year here, the minute you start using slang, Professor Norton, it's not cool anymore. So there are limits, right? But as long as you appear genuine, and you are genuine in the efforts, and people don't think you're just putting on a show, identification can work, right? Other limits is that audiences don't always want somebody just like them. Sometimes they feel like they need someone who can complement their weaknesses with strengths they don't have. Particularly, we think about this in more formal forums, maybe. I mean, if I need a lawyer, I want one better than me, right? And if someone's going to be running our government, like, I don't care that they're an academic, that they look just like me or think a lot like me. I need somebody who's competent and going to do that well. So there are limits to this notion of identification. So we need to consider the audience's perspective always when we're thinking about character. And audiences bring their own values, beliefs, and knowledges to interactions. So understanding what those are is important to being able to demonstrate respect, and even when disagreeing with those, indicating respect for those positions if you have it, and goodwill. if you have it part's the hard part, right? Sometimes we don't always respect the people's positions that we're arguing with. And we should talk in class about what to do at that point. Do we demonstrate that? What are our goals in those situations might make a big difference. Also, finally, demonstrating appropriate self-interest can be important. Framing our advocacy in other-centered terms helps, right? Knowing that people want us to do things and help them, not just help ourselves. So demonstrating how our positions or our advocacy benefits the group that we're talking to can be a really direct way to persuade them and to bring them on board. Inevitably, whenever my husband wants to buy something new for the house, he'll tell me how it's going to make my life easier. Whether it's putting in lights that come on when we walk into the storage room so that we don't waste electricity and they go off, because then I don't have to remember to turn them off. Or something else. You do this and your friends do this perhaps as well, but thinking in terms of how we benefit others makes a big difference. Also, being free of vested interests, or at least honest about them, is also important in demonstrating our character and goodwill. I'm not saying you'll never have a vested interest in what's going on. I think that's naive to think that we wouldn't benefit from our own advocacy, but having that in a proper place, and at least admitting when that's the case, is helpful because it helps with our trustworthiness. So reluctant advocates, we know, those who could be hurt by their own testimony, or whistleblowers, those things are especially powerful because we assume that audiences will understand that our motives are pure in this. So we're not doing this to get something, and that it might even end up hurting us in the end. So I think that one of the examples in the text is, billionaires who say, I should be taxed more. Right? You wouldn't think they would think that, maybe, unless, so you might give them a little bit more credibility. Maybe you think billionaires would assume that they shouldn't be taxed more, right? So students who come to me and say, you're not assigning enough work. Wow, would I listen to that, right? Because I'm assuming that you think I'm assigning enough work, or that you would not like to do even more work in my classes. So reluctant advocates and whistleblowers, people who tell the truth at the risk of themselves, are often taken especially powerful testimony. Jailhouse snitches, or the equivalent, are suspect, however, because we assume that they might be saying this thing just so they get an advantage. Can you think of other people? I mean, I hope you don't have a lot of experience with jailhouse snitches in your lives, maybe, but what about other places where you wonder, are you just telling me this so that you will, because you're going to get something out of it, and therefore, can I trust you more? I'll be interested in your examples of that in class. That wraps up sound character and goodwill, so we're going to move more to a discussion of dynamism, and I'm terribly interested to know who you love to listen to and why. I'm not thinking about this I'm not telling you about or thinking about this in terms of music, although maybe it could work that way. I'm thinking in terms of people you want to learn or that you like to listen to speak. So, one of the major places you probably hear this right now are in your classes. So I want to hear about the professors that you enjoy listening to and why that's the case. Or people that, maybe even comedians, if you tune in to listen on or watch those, whatever you watch, wherever you watch that. Maybe you watch folks on TED Talks or these things. I don't know. I don't know who you listen to and why, but I'm interested in who you keep going back to and why that is the case. What makes them interesting, fun, or engaging? Because dynamism is a kind of a hard thing to pin down. Speaking style isn't everything in an advocate. Lord knows it's not everything, but it's far from irrelevant. If you want people to listen to you as an advocate, and if you want to listen to advocates, having at least a marginal, right? At least like some kind of engaging speaking style can be super helpful, as long as it seems a little bit natural too. because we know dynamism is a compelling personal style in some kind of way. By the way, that looks different for everybody else. A compelling personal style to you is different than to somebody else, both as a receiver and as a performer. If you've ever tried to mimic somebody and take on and decide like, oh, they're really good at this, I'm going to try it, and it just seems awkward and it looks awkward and everybody's uncomfortable, that's not a compelling style for you. It might be for them, but it's not for you, right? So dynamism is a hard thing to pin down, but we do know a few things. It usually has some energy to it, right? It usually has some engagement with it. We'll talk more about these facets in a minute, but the purpose or the thought to remember about dynamism is that it can signal conviction, right? It lets people know that you're in, that you're excited about a topic, and it also can be overdone, as well as being audience sensitive. So how do we demonstrate dynamism? I mean, we could just practice and go around the room and have you be your most dynamic self, which I think would be terribly fun, but probably isn't appropriate or really especially relevant. But if you want to join in, or if you want to raise your hand to do that, let me know and we'll work you in on Wednesday. But we're going to consider dynamism to be the projecting of an appropriate level of confidence, right? If you don't believe what you're saying, nobody else will either. And so you want to at least speak with some confidence. By the way, you can fake that, right? Confidence can easily be faked, and with a few tips. There used to be a saying when I was a college debater: if you weren't sure, just say it loudly, or say it with confidence. And I used the same technique. I used to announce all of the names at graduation, which made me terribly nervous, and I practiced a lot, and I had all kinds of ways of doing it, but eventually the best way to do it was to look at the name and read it without the question in your voice, right? So an appropriate level of confidence goes a long way to persuading people. Also, not being afraid to show your passion, right? Like, different audiences have different levels of expectation and even tolerance around issues of passion, but showing people that you're excited about something is not a problem, or that you have care in this, really leads them to be engaged. Affecting and engaging speaking style about speaking with an audience instead of at an audience is also important. You know if you're being spoken at, if it matters that there's an audience there at all, and not even if you're in the audience, right? But if there's an audience, someone who's simply output. I'm not suggesting that presentations have to be conversations, but I do think that the best presentations tend to be conversations with an audience where the speaker does all of the talking, right? They make assumptions about the audience, hopefully well-founded ones, and there's a give and take that happens, similar to reading a book, right? You make marks in the margins, perhaps, in your textbooks, or you're asking questions of them along the way, and the author knows that you're doing that. Finally, a good level of energy is often helpful. You don't have to be over the top, but, bring it a little bit. Final point I want to make is about the advocate-listener relationship and how that relates to credibility. And this goes back to some discussions that we've had over the last couple of weeks, and the textbook generally takes a position on, right, of this co-creating argument of having a more cooperative approach. And that's this note that the advocate and listener relationship matters. How we position ourselves as advocates in relationship to the people that we are arguing with and arguing in front of makes a difference. And there are a number of different ways to do that. Brock Reedy talks about this in this metaphor, right, in three different ways. So he says that there can be abusers, right, critics or arguers who essentially victimize their co-arguers or their audience. They do this by dominating the discussion, by using silence as a weapon, by victimizing people verbally in particular ways. And we know those, right? You've perhaps seen folks who take audience or take argumentation as blood sport and no holds barred, right? This doesn't, by the way, get us to very good decisions as a community, although if that's what you're into, it might be fun. It also tends to turn off relationships and not want people to argue with you very often in the future. So it shuts down argumentation. Perhaps you have been or are a seducer when it comes to argument, right? Manipulating through charm or deceit. I would be interested to hear, if any of you work in retail, how the training goes around how you convince people to buy additional kinds of things, right? Sometimes folks in retail have been accused of being seducers. I don't think you all are, by the way. But we also do know that, what is the saying? That you attract more flies with honey, right? Being charming or not telling the whole truth is sometimes ways that people go about argument, right? By the way, that one can also be short-lived. If people feel manipulated, they're less likely to do what you want them to do. And it also can put them on guard in the future. So you can risk your credibility a little bit by trying to do this too much. I saw this coming the other day. I had a good example of this. Through LinkedIn, I got a request to be a connection to somebody from the same university I went to. Right? So, I mean, I graduated like 25 years ago from college. But I got a note saying, from someone who is a more recent graduate saying, I love Manchester grads. They're the best. I'd love to connect with anybody who's, had the same experience as I had at the lovely liberal arts college that we went to. So I looked down and I figured that I knew it was going to happen because I saw that he was a personal financial consultant. So I accepted, honestly, just to probably test my own theory of what was coming next. So of course I accepted his invitation, and the next message that came back was, I care about Manchester graduates' ability to maintain financial security. Let me know when we can make an appointment. Would next week be good to have coffee and discuss how we can secure your financial future? Right? So he was working on the seduction model, right? I think. Trying to pull me in as a Manchester grad and then suggest that he really cared about my financial future, when I really think he probably is trying to build his portfolio. I kindly told him that my husband works in finance and we're okay, right? And so he perhaps could have, and maybe was moving into lover category instead, right? Respect and engage partners in good decision making, but he was starting out in what felt like a more manipulative frame of mind. So lovers is the third one. We don't want to make too much out of this, but it's respect and engaging partners in good decision making. When we meet people as equals, then we see them differently in decision making and as co-arguers as well. So your bonus point land this week asks for you to add categories to this, right? You can keep on in this metaphor frame if you like, or you could rework the metaphor and offer a different one for the ways that we can position ourselves in relationship to each other as arguers. I'm looking forward to hearing more of those. I hope you do that one. So in conclusion, right, responsible, credible advocates do some basic things. They only claim as much knowledge as they possess. They do their good research and bring knowledge that they genuinely have. They use their initial and transactional credibility well. They make honest appraisals of their own character and their disposition toward their audience, and bring them their best selves to these and show the audience how they identify with them. And finally, they project an air of confidence through appropriately dynamic delivery, style, and engagement with the audience. And they perhaps shy away from being abusers or maybe even seducers in their relationship postures. All right, this is it. I'll see you on Wednesday to have a good discussion about these concepts.